If President Kennedy's assassination was the work of a conspiracy instead of a lone gunman, then the Italian-American Mafia is one of the prime suspects for being behind it. After all, why would a mafia associate quickly murder the alleged assassin before he could talk to investigators? Join us as we explore the question of, did the mafia kill JFK? The Italian-American Mafia is supposed to have a set of rules that were designed to preserve the longevity of their organization. One rule states that government officials shouldn't be harmed because that would invite a retaliation that could wipe them out. The New Orleans family found this out the hard way in 1891. But corrupt officials are considered a gray area as they had traded in their ideals and entered the mob's world of warped justice. Here is how they could have justified assassinating JFK under their ethics. Perhaps no actual real biological family in American modern history is as polarizing as the Kennedys. But love them or hate them, our 35th President John is a legitimate World War II hero. He was the lieutenant of a PT boat that was sank, and while he was injured during the attack, he managed to tow a badly burned crewmate to an island by clenching the man's life preserver strap in his teeth and swimming in 1943. The story became publicized the following year, and it launched the man's career into politics once peacetime returned. While John F. Kennedy was the only member of his family to become president, both of his younger brothers were also prominent in politics, and these men all owe their success to the dynasty that their father Joseph created. And part of the reason Joseph became so successful was thanks to his ties with organized crime. Although Joseph was Irish-American, he came from a wealthy and prominent Boston family with a father who was engaged in the city's local politics. Born in 1888, Joseph Kennedy would later graduate from Harvard, where he afterwards found employment as assistant general manager of the Bethlehem Steel Shipyard in his hometown. Through this position, he became friendly with future President Franklin D. Roosevelt during World War I, when FDR was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Decades later, President Roosevelt appointed his friend Joe to become the ambassador to Great Britain. In the Roaring Twenties, he made a fortune as a stock and commodities trader, which he then used to diversify into other businesses like movie studios and real estate, which made him even richer. As a titan of business, he continued to diversify his holdings, and he found one business that is traditionally recession-proof. But unfortunately, it was not legal yet. Joe Kennedy entered the liquor market in the waning days of Prohibition, when it was clear that it was soon to be repealed as it was a failure. His goal was to become the American distributor for several high-end liquor brands from Europe. And to get these legal contracts, he had to have his timing right. If he waited until the official repeal, then someone else could beat him to it. So it's been rumored that he entered the market when it was still illegal, causing him to need to partner with the mafia for domestic distribution purposes. Kennedy's mafia connections would come into play later in life when his son John was running for president as the Democrat Party's nominee. In the 1960 election, the contest was between JFK and then Vice President Richard Nixon, and it was closer than most people remember. It's been alleged that Joe Kennedy reached out to some of his old Cosa Nostra connections in Chicago to guarantee, through voter fraud, that his son won the city, because then he would win that state and its crucial electoral college votes. For the Chicago outfit, the arrangement was a win-win for them, as it was not that hard to pull off, and the payoff would be that the man in the nation's highest government office would be in their debt. Any evidence of this deal is pure hearsay, but if it was true, then it appears that Joe did not tell his son about it, because the Kennedy administration would go on to become one of the biggest threats the mob had ever faced. This would be seen as a betrayal by Joseph Kennedy, and his perceived double-crossing would provide justification to retaliate on his sons. What exactly did JFK do to the mob that would make them kill him on November 22, 1963, when just 3 years earlier they were happy to have their guy in the White House? The reasons were Cuba, Jimmy Hoffa, and Bobby Kennedy. While the Mafia built Las Vegas during the 1950s, it was an afterthought when compared to the much more lucrative Havana casinos. It was a huge moneymaker, right until Fidel Castro took the world by surprise and overthrew the Batista regime. He kicked the mob out and nationalized their hotels, which angered the mobsters because their cash cows became large investment losses. The Cuban Revolution climaxed on New Year's Day 1959, which was at the end of the Eisenhower administration. While it took America's leaders by surprise, they did not like the idea of having a communist country in their backyard, and so they began plans to launch an invasion of the island, but they didn't want to put American boots on the ground. Instead, the CIA recruited anti-Castro Cuban exiles and gave them extensive training plus weapons. Recently declassified files reveal that the Mafia helped facilitate the recruitment of these men. The Chicago outfit leadership played an integral role during this period. The goal was to land on the island with American air support and then move inland to begin a counter-revolution. But this strategy took time and would only be ready for the next president to execute it. JFK became that next president, and while the plan went through, he cut back on the direct American military support because he seemed to have lost his nerve and did not want the moral appearance of invading a weaker neighbor. What became known as the Bay of Pigs disaster upset a lot of people, which included members of the CIA, the Cuban exiles who were abandoned, and the American Mafia, who had hoped that this invasion would give them back their casinos. Other declassified files reveal that the CIA had worked with the mob to have Castro assassinated in a separate plot, but those plans never came to fruition. The following year, any hope for retaking Cuba was killed with the Cuban Missile Crisis. With Cuba lost, Las Vegas took on greater importance for the mob, and they built the large resorts and casinos of that city using money borrowed from the Teamsters Pension Fund. This is where Jimmy Hoffa enters the picture, as he became president of that union in 1957. The arrangement was simple. He provided the mobsters with money for their projects that would make them more money, and they, in return, propped up his power in the Union. But Jimmy Hoffa also enjoyed fame, and while the spotlight was pointed at him, he caught the attention of Bobby Kennedy, who correctly believed him to be corrupt. Bobby began his career as a lawyer, and thanks to his family's political connections, he became a legal counselor for Senator Joseph McCarthy's quest to root out communists during the 1950s Red Scare. While these events made McCarthy famous while also leading to his downfall, Bobby's work impressed a lot of people, and he was promoted to chief counsel for the Senate's Permanent Subcommittee of Investigations in 1955. This is the same year that the film On the Waterfront became a huge hit, and with it, the subject of labor racketeering became a pressing issue for the American public. And with the Teamsters Union connection to the Mafia, they were in the aggressive young attorney's crosshairs. With Kennedy's election in November of 1960, the mob thought that their help would lead to Joe reining in his sons so that they could get back to business as usual. But in 1961, When Kennedy's cabinet was assembled, JFK appointed his brother Bobby to become the Attorney General, which made him the top law enforcement official in the country. And Bobby's increase of power only intensified his prosecution of Hoffa and the Mafia. During the last year of the Eisenhower administration, just 35 low-level gangsters were convicted across America, mainly for minor gambling charges. But between January 1961 and November 1963, 116 made men and associates were indicted on Bobby Kennedy's quest against them, including Jimmy Hoffa. What began for the Mafia as anger against the president's policies turned into what they perceived as an open war to destroy them. They correctly perceived that Bobby Kennedy's power came from his president brother, and that the only way to remove the crusader was to take out the man who backed him. For a conspiracy to work, it's best that as few people as possible are part of it, so that it remains a secret. While the Mafia killed Kennedy is a conspiracy theory full of circumstantial evidence, there is nothing that indicates that the murder was approved by the Commission, which is the governing body of the National Crime Syndicate headquartered in New York. But there are two family bosses connected to the story of the mob killing JFK: Carlos Marcello of New Orleans and Santo Trafficante Jr. of Florida. For Trafficante Jr., his hatred for the Kennedys was mainly fueled by how they gave up Cuba in his eyes. Cuba was shared by the families, but its geographic proximity put it in Florida's sphere of influence. During the 1940s and 50s, the Trafficante family tried to expand a permanent presence on the island without success, and the Cuban Revolution took away a huge chunk of their income, which diminished their power. For Carlos Marcello, his hatred of the Kennedys, particularly Bobby, was very personal. Marcello came to the United States as a baby and never became a citizen. One day in 1961, he went to what he thought was a routine visit to his local immigration office. Instead, it turned out to be an ambush that ended with him being deported to Guatemala without anyone being notified. He was essentially dumped in the jungle in his suit and loafers, where it took him a few days to find a phone and get in contact with his people. A month later, he snuck back into the country, and his lawyers arranged in court that he wouldn't be deported again like that. The information that Marcello and Trafficante were working together in a conspiracy to murder JFK comes from Trafficante's attorney, Frank Ragano, in his book Mob Lawyer. According to him, Ragano was the contact between the mob bosses and Jimmy Hoffa so that the FBI would never witness direct communication between the men they were investigating. He claims that it was Hoffa who came up with the idea to kill the president because he saw that JFK's death would lead to an end to the federal investigations that Bobby was pursuing against them. He dutifully passed the message to Trafficante and never heard anything else about the matter until the day of the assassination, when he saw his boss celebrating the news that JFK was dead. Because of Ragano's closeness with Trafficante, he would often be present at restaurant dinners in Miami, where the Florida boss would entertain the visiting heads of other families. At one dinner, he overheard Chicago boss Sam Giancana recall that it was his people who fixed the votes in Cook County. In his own words, he said, "We broke our balls for him and gave him the election, and he gets his brother to hound us to death." Other mobsters who might not have been in on the conspiracy certainly approved of the president's untimely death. Tommy Lucchese allegedly said in a sarcastic tone that it could not have happened to a nicer guy. Frank Ragano was Italian-American, and he could speak the language of the old country. He certainly knew who his clients were, even if it was never explicitly said. Sicilians would be very indirect and yet clear when they speak to each other because the context is always understood. Americans are much more on the nose with their speech, and it was through Ragano's close relationship to Jimmy Hoffa that many blanks of how much the Mafia infiltrated American society were filled in. Trafficante got Frank Ragano to become part of Jimmy Hoffa's legal team, but the lawyer was never paid directly. Instead, like his Mafia clients, he was granted favors through the Teamsters Pension Fund, like financing for speculative real estate developments he was pursuing. Hoffa recounted to the mob lawyer that the relationship between the Mafia and the Union began in the 1930s, when the owners of the trucking companies would bring in strikebreakers to rough up the Teamsters. The Teamsters then turned to the mob for muscle to fight back, and from there, the two organizations became intertwined. And in Mafia-controlled cities, Union locals were created on paper only so that Union voters could be manipulated to ensure that the Mafia-appointed leaders won their elections. Hoffa believed that he could maintain the balance between the mob's backing and what was best for his Union members, and in a way, he did have some success. Between 1957, when he became president, and 1963, the membership of the Teamsters more than doubled. But the relationship between the two groups did not go unnoticed, and Kennedy's investigation into both organizations were relentless. The Attorney General was consuming a lot of the Union president's time, and eventually Hoffa figured it would be best to take care of his legal problems at their source, which led to his message to Trafficante Jr. and Marcello. To many, Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone gunman who killed the president, but he did have some ties to organized crime. One of his uncles, Dutz Murrett, lived in New Orleans and was a bookmaker for Carlos Marcello, which makes him a mob associate. In the summer of 1963, Oswald was living in New Orleans when he was arrested for distributing pro-Castro leaflets. It's speculated that this encounter might have gotten him on Marcello's radar, and with his military history combined with his strong feelings against the US government, he could have been recruited by the mob boss to help take out the president. Oswald was living in Dallas that fall, and in the weeks before the assassination, he got the job at the book depository. Shortly before November 22nd, the president's motor route was rerouted, causing his car to drive by the building at a lower speed due to a curve. Was this a coincidence, or were there members of our government upset about the president's policies who were also conspiring with the mob to assassinate Castro that deliberately altered his route to make sure JFK and Oswald would meet? Likewise, the unbelievability of the magic bullet theory suggests that there was a second shooter in front of the motorcade who fired the fatal shot at the president's head. Many witnesses on the scene claim the shots came from the grassy knoll. If there was another person there, who were they, and could they have been a mob associate whose job was to make sure the president was definitely dead? The world would never get to hear Lee Harvey Oswald's story from his own mouth, and he was shortly murdered by Dallas Mafia family associate Jack Ruby. Ruby maintained that he killed Oswald on his own because he was angry about his president's death, which is a contradictory feeling for a mobster to have, but maybe he was very low level. Either way, the man died in 1967, and on his deathbed, he maintained that he acted alone. In 1963, Bobby Kennedy's war against the mob and Jimmy Hoffa were at full throttle. Many high-ranking members were under government surveillance with wiretaps. This was a new technology that the mob was unaware of, and as a result, many members spoke freely on the phone about their feelings and activities. And they did let out their hatred for JFK and his family freely. But the Mafia investigations began to cool almost immediately once Vice President Lyndon Johnson became the new commander-in-chief. Many of the FBI's wiretaps were done without warrants and would be inadmissible. At the time, it was thought of as a necessary evil to help the government penetrate a world that had been effectively sealed off from them. But LBJ was concerned about civil rights and how the wiretaps could look like the act of a totalitarian government, and the program was soon shut down. Furthermore, tensions between the new president and Bobby would cause the younger Kennedy to leave his position. And with that, the investigations into the mob effectively came to an end for the moment. If the goal of murdering JFK was to stop the legal crusade being waged against them, then the Mafia had a decisive win. The Kennedy assassination was said to have triggered the largest federal investigation in history, with the results being delivered to the Warren Commission. On September 27, 1964, they released their findings and said that Oswald and Ruby both acted alone. In the ensuing years, the majority of the wiretap tapes of the mobsters would be lost, and all that would remain would be memos or partial transcripts. Bobby Kennedy came close to securing the Democratic Party's nomination for president in 1968 before being killed by an assassin's bullet. But like prior presidents that were not his brother, he was murdered at close range, and his killer was clearly identified as Sirhan Sirhan. Sirhan was Palestinian and says he killed Bobby because of his support of Israel. But many Americans did not believe the official findings of the Warren Commission, and during the 1970s, there were multiple investigations in the House and Senate to determine if the American Mafia played a role in JFK's murder. And with many government records from the time now missing, the politicians decided to bring the mobsters into public hearings for the entire world to see. In 1975, Chicago boss Sam Giancana was subpoenaed to testify to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence about his connections to the CIA and their plans to assassinate Castro. On the night before his appearance, he was murdered in his home by 3 gunshots, one to the back of his head that killed him, one in his mouth, and one more in his throat. The extra 2 shots are said to have been symbolic to represent that he has been talking, and now he will never rat again. In 1976, Chicago outfit member John Rosselli met with the Senate committee behind closed doors. 2 days later, he vanished, and 2 weeks after that, his body was found with its legs cut off and stuffed into a 55-gallon oil drum that had been sunk in North Miami. There have been claims that he was the second shooter during the assassination, but these have never been confirmed. At the same time, the House Select Committee on Assassinations was looking into the deaths of JFK and Martin Luther King Jr. They received testimony from Edward Becker, an associate of Carlos Marcello, about the man's personal hatred of the Kennedys and how he swore revenge. Marcello himself was brought in to testify, and while he admitted that his deportation enraged him, he denied ever making threats against JFK and his brother, and also denied having any involvement in the assassination. Santo Trafficante Jr. was also brought in to testify, and he denied any involvement in the Mafia and the assassination. He did admit that he was recruited by the CIA to murder Castro, but claimed his role was limited to being a lowly translator. Any other details about this he claimed to no longer remember. The House investigation lasted for 2 years, and in the end, they determined that they had doubts with the Warren Commission's narrative. They determined that if there was a conspiracy, then the Soviet Union, Cuba, and the CIA weren't involved, but they could not rule out the Mafia. They also determined that if the mob was orchestrating it, then it was most likely Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante Jr. pulling the strings. They believed that there was no direct proof of a second shooter, but there was enough circumstantial evidence to not discount the possibility. However, they could only definitively confirm Oswald as a shooter and had no clue who the other people could have been. These results only fueled speculation that Lee Harvey Oswald was a fall guy set up by Carlos Marcello while the real mafia killers got away with murder. Informants would later claim that Marcello said, "Don't kill the dog, kill the head, and the tail will die." The dog was meant to be RFK, and the head was JFK. Carlos Marcello was sent to prison for a corruption scandal, and he later developed dementia. By contrast, Santo Trafficante Jr. retained leadership over his family during that decade until his death. According to Frank Ragano, the two men remained close, and on Friday, March 13, 1987, he picked up Trafficante from his home, and the two went on a drive alone. By this point, the Florida boss was in very poor health, and in his older age, he did not have many peers left. So on the drive, he reminisced with Ragano about their shared past and the people in it. Speaking in Sicilian, he said to Ragano, "God damn, Bobby, I think Carlos messed up in getting rid of Giovanni. Maybe it should have been Bobby." Ragano knew that Giovanni meant John. During that ride, he also shared Jimmy Hoffa's final moments with his lawyer. According to him, Hoffa was brought out to a house in Detroit for what he thought was a meeting. Instead, he was knocked out and strangled to death by a hit team assembled by Tony Pro, a Genovese capo from New Jersey. Frank Ragano spent his life surrounded by mobsters and always knew that it was best not to ask questions when someone said something incriminating, so he just listened. It was his belief that Trafficante's confession was more of a boast. They killed the president and got away with it. 4 days later, the Florida boss died during heart surgery at the age of 72. Frank Ragano's book broke his vow of silence, but it came out after his clients had been dead. To those that knew him, his book served as a confession about how his ambition and avarice caused him to compromise his morals. He died in his sleep in 1998 at the age of 75. The Mafia conspiracy to murder JFK relies on circumstantial evidence as the people involved are long dead, and any possible physical evidence is now lost or destroyed. But given how the federal government effectively ceased its investigations into Cosa Nostra in the aftermath, the mob enjoyed 20 years of prosperity, which makes them among the biggest winners from JFK's death.